Hi, in this lab we'll be setting up a 2-node failover cluster, and we'll be setting up and configuring SQL Always on availability groups, which will host our Citrix databases. We'll be using the developer edition of SQL, SQL Server 2017. The developer edition maps roughly to the enterprise edition of SQL, which will allow us to use always on availability groups. If you've got a standard edition of SQL, you have to use something called basic availability groups, bags. But with bags, you have to have a separate availability group for each database. So that's why we're using the developer edition of SQL in this lab. We've got two nodes, node 1 and node 2. Both servers are basically joined to the domain. My domain is carmo.com. They've been configured with a static IP. They've got the latest Windows updates. Windows firewall is off. Internet enhanced security is also off. So let's begin. We're going to jump onto node 1 and we're going to kick off the install of SQL Server. I've mapped the ISO file for SQL Server 2017, so we're just going to double click on that. We're then going to click on installation, and because we're running a non-clustered install of SQL, we choose the option New SQL Server Standalone Installation. If we were going to use failover clustered instances and use a clustered install of SQL, we'd be using this option. But as we're just using always on availability groups with no shared storage, we'll just be choosing this option here, New SQL Server Standalone Installation. The edition is Developer Edition, so we'll click Next. We'll accept the licensing terms, click Next. We're not going to perform any Microsoft update to check for any updates, so we'll click Next again. Now under the feature selection, we need to choose Database Engine Services, and we also need to select SQL Server Replication. We don't need to select any other options. We're going to leave the default installation paths. We're going to click on Next. Under the instance selection, we're not going to create a specifically named instance for Citrix. We're just going to use the default MS SQL Server SQL instance. So we'll click Next on here. Under the SQL services, we've got the SQL Server Agent, SQL Server Database Engine, and SQL Server Browser. It's recommended to use an Active Directory account for that. So I've created a service account called svc-SQL. I'm going to enter that. Enter the password. Same for the Database Engine service. Again, we'll be using the same account. Enter the password. And then we're going to click on Next. Actually, under collation, we'll set up the collation for Citrix. Citrix uses a specific collation for most of their databases, so we'll set that now. It's Latin 1 General 100, and it's normally AS and KS as well. Accent sensitive and kana sensitive. Okay, click OK on that. Click on Next. Under the authentication mode, we're not going to be using mixed mode, which is SQL Server Auth and Windows Auth. We'll just be using Windows Auth. Specify the SQL Server admins. We're going to add a group that I created called SQL_admins. We're just going to leave the default directories. We're not going to change any of that. We're not going to change any of the directories for the temp DB. So we'll click Next on that. And then we're going to click on Install. the installation will now kick off. What I'll do is I'll pause the video and I'll resume the video once the installation is complete. Okay, the installation has now succeeded. We can check information about the setup here. We've got to make sure everything was good and succeeded. There's also a log file here you can check, which will give you some of the installation information. We're just going to click on close here, and that's basically it. We've now set up and installed SQL. What I'm going to do is I'm going to perform the same installation on node number 2. So what I'll do is I'll pause and then I'll resume the video once we've finished the installation on node 2. The installation of SQL on node 2 is now finished. We used exactly the same setup options as we did on node 1. What we're going to do now is we're going to install SQL Server Management Studio on node 1. So I'm going to click on close on here, close out of the installation, jump back to node 1, and I've downloaded SQL Server Management Studio, which will allow us to connect to our SQL instance and manage our databases. So I'm going to kick off the setup. Click on install. The installation of SQL Server Management Studio took quite a while, so what I did is I've paused and cut that section of the installation out because it did take about a good 10 minutes, 15 minutes for it to install. As you can see now, the SQL Server Management Studio installation is being completed, and we now have SQL Server Management Studio. What we're going to do now is we're just going to connect to both SQL instances on both node 1 and node 2, just to make sure that they're working correctly. So to do that, we'll use SQL Server Management Studio. If we click on Start menu, click on SQL Server 2017. Under the tools, we should have SQL Server Management Studio 17. What I'm going to do is I'm going to basically pin that to the taskbar for easier access, and then we're going to just double click on the SQL Server Management Studio. Okay, Management Studio is now loading up. What we're going to do is we're going to use Windows Auth. I'm going to connect using my Carmo administrator account. That account is part of the SQL_admins, so we should have sysadmin permissions on this SQL instance. So first of all, we're going to connect to node 1. Click on connect. It's connected successfully. What we're going to do as well is we're just going to connect to node 2 as well. So click on connect again, click on database engine, and then we'll change that to node 2. Again, we'll be using Windows Auth, same account, click on connect. It threw up the following message when I tried to connect to node 2 through SQL Server Management Studio, connecting to database engine services. It's basically saying that the server was not found or was not accessible. So we're just going to jump onto node 2 just to make sure that the SQL instance service is started and there's no other issues. So we'll open up services.msc. What we're looking for is the Microsoft SQL service, which is under MS SQL. This one here. So the actual SQL instance is running and it's started, which is good. So that looks okay. I'm just going to check the SQL Server Configuration Manager just to make sure that name pipes and TCP/IP is enabled. And the service, service is started. I can see name pipes and TCP/IP is disabled, so we're just going to enable both of those. Enable TCP/IP, and then what we're going to do is we're just going to restart the SQL Server instance service. Just do a restart on that. Okay, service has been restarted. So if we now go back over to Node 1 and through Management Studio, SQL Server Management Studio, if we now try connect to Node 2, Node 2 now works. So we've tested both nodes, we've connected to both instances are working, and that's basically all we needed to do just to make sure that the configuration that we've done so far is working how it should. What we'll do now is we'll start to install the Microsoft Failover cluster services and get the cluster configured, and then we'll start configuring always on availability groups once we've got the cluster configured. I'm going to pause the video, and then in the next video we'll start to install Microsoft Failover cluster services. We're now going to install the Microsoft Failover clustering feature. So to do that, we need to jump onto both Node 1 and Node 2. We'll bring up Admin Tools. We'll go into Server Manager. And then under Manage, we'll click on Add Roles and Features. Once Server Manager has stopped inventorying the server. There we go. So we'll click on Next. We're going to choose a role-based or feature-based installation. It's going to be the local server. Click on Next. And then under server roles, the Microsoft Failover clustering is actually a feature rather than a server role. So we'll click Next on that, and then we'll tick Failover clustering. It's going to install the PowerShell modules and also the RSAT tools, the MMC tools for managing the cluster as well. So we'll click on Add Features, click on Next, click on Install. What we'll do now is we'll jump onto Node 2 and we'll do exactly the same. So we'll go into Windows Admin Tools, click on Server Manager, wait for the inventory to complete. We'll click on Tools, we'll click on click on Add Roles and Features, click on Next, Role-Based or Feature-Based Installation, click on Next on Server Selection. It's not a role, so we're going to click on Next. Then we're going to put a tick in the Failover clustering, click on Add Features, click on Next, and then click on Install. So if we jump onto Node 1, we can see that the installation is completed. So we'll click on Close, and then we'll close out of Server Manager, and then we'll just wait for the installation to finish on Node 2, and then we'll start to set up our Failover cluster. What I'll do on Node 1 while that's waiting is we'll load the Failover Cluster Manager. As we're not using failover clustered instances and the clustered install of SQL with shared storage, we not actually using that clustered install of SQL, so we don't need any shared storage for this cluster. So what we'll be using as our quorum, as our witness, is just a file share. What you typically would do for the file share, you would have that on a scale out file server cluster, or you would have it on a DFS namespace with multiple DFS folder targets. In my lab, I'm just going to create a share on my domain controller, and we'll use that as the witness, the witness share, as the file share for the witness. So the installation is completed on Node 2, so we'll close out of this, close out of that, and then from Node 1 we'll start getting the cluster created. So what we're going to do is, with Failover Cluster Manager opened, we're going to click on Create Cluster. We're going to click on Next, and then we're going to enter the servers who are going to participate in this cluster. So the servers are node1.carmo.com. We'll click on add, and then we'll type in node2.carmo.com. Click on add. Okay, it would help if I could spell. node2.carmo.com. Okay, that looks like it's okay. We'll click on next. Typically when you create a cluster, you have to run a cluster validation report. So that checks things like drivers and checks the NIC binding order and checks the heartbeat NIC and checks all the shared storage. You have to basically run that for Microsoft to be able to support the cluster. As this is just a lab, we won't be running that. We're just not going to run the cluster validation. And we're going to click on next on that. The access point for administering the cluster, this is going to be the cluster name. So this will be the name that gets added as a clustered resource into the cluster. So we'll just be using SQL cluster as the cluster name. We need to give the cluster name an IP as well. So this has to be an unused IP. So I will set that to 192.168.3.132, which is currently an unused IP. Most clusters have two NICs. They have a dedicated NIC for the heartbeat network, but in this lab we're just going to have a single NIC and use that for the cluster communication and also the heartbeat communication as well. So we'll click next on that. We get confirmation of our options we've selected. Add all eligible storage to the cluster. We don't actually have any shared storage as we're not using, as I say, a clustered install of SQL. So we don't need any shared storage, so it shouldn't add anything to the cluster. So we'll click on next. What we'll do while that setup is going through, we'll log onto my domain controller and we'll create a share basically for our witness share. So if we log onto our domain controller, I'm going to basically load up my E drive, and then if we go into 1 second, let's close all these windows down. Got too many windows open, so we'll open this PC, and then we'll create a new folder, and then we'll call this SQL Witness Share. Okay, there we go. What we've got to do now, we'll share this folder. So if we go into sharing, click on advanced sharing, share name will just be SQL Witness Share. Under permissions, we're going to basically remove everyone, and then we're going to add both nodes of the cluster. So node 1, change the object types to computer, node 1, give that full control. We're going to then add node 2. Again, we're going to give that full control, and then we're going to actually add the cluster name as well. So the cluster name was SQL cluster. Hopefully it's been created. Yep, click OK on that, click apply on that, and then click on OK. So we've shared this new folder. So the folder name is SQL Witness Share. The permissions, we've removed the everyone group, and we've gave full control to both nodes in the cluster as well as the actual cluster name itself. Okay, so we'll click apply on that, click OK, click on close. Again, in production, this would be a share literally on a scale out file server or it would be on a DFS namespace with multiple folder targets for redundancy. But just in the lab, it's okay just to create it on my domain controller for the time being. So the cluster has now been set up, as you can see. You successfully completed the create cluster wizard. So we'll click on finish here. If we expand the cluster out, click on nodes, we can see both nodes are up. If we click on the actual cluster itself, that's the cluster name and the cluster IP address. So they're both online, which is a good sign. What we're going to do now is we're just going to change that quorum to use a file share witness and use that new share that we've just created. So with the cluster selected, if we right click and go to more actions and then click on configure cluster quorum settings, we're going to click on next, and then we're going to select the quorum witness, and then we're going to configure a file share witness rather than using a disk witness. You would typically use a disk witness if you're using shared storage, but we're just going to use a file share witness because we've got no shared storage. So we'll click on next, and then we'll click on browse, and the server that this shares on is on DC01. So click on browse on that, DC01, check name, click on OK, and then we can see all the shares on DC01. So the share we created specifically for this witness disk is SQL witness share. We'll click on OK, click on next, click on next again. You have successfully configured the quorum settings for the cluster, so you can see we're now using a file share witness, and the witness resource is on DC01 under a shared folder called SQL witness share. If we click on finish, what we'll now see is we'll see now as part of the cluster resources, we now have our file share witness, and that is it. So the cluster is now set up. What we'll do in the next video is we'll then start now to configure SQL Always On availability groups and get the setup configured for that, and then we'll start getting the databases created and added to the availability group. The databases will just be empty databases that we'll use as part of the Zen desktop setup, and during the installation and setup it will populate the databases with the schema and the correct tables. So I'm going to stop this video, and then in the next video, as I say, we'll get the SQL Always On availability groups configured. Now the setup of the cluster is complete. We've just got to finish the configuration of Always On. So to do that, what we need to do is we need to go into the Start menu. We need to click on the SQL Server 2017 Configuration Manager. And then with the instance selected under SQL Server Services, we need to right click and choose Properties. And then under Always On High Availability, we need to tick the box to enable Always On availability groups. We click on Apply and then click on OK. And then we need to restart the instance. So we'll click on Restart. We need to repeat that same process on node 2. So again, we'll click on Start, and then we'll open the SQL Server 2017 Configuration Manager. With the instance selected, we'll right click, choose Properties, Always On Availability. We'll enable it, click Apply, click OK, and then we'll restart the instance. So we've now enabled Always On High Availability on both SQL nodes. So there is now a few prereqs. So we need to allow the cluster account the create computer object permissions on the OU where the cluster resides, because when we create the availability group, it creates an always on availability listener, and the listener has a computer object within Active Directory, so the cluster is responsible for creating that. So under the OU SQL, I've got my cluster account, which is SQL cluster, and then I've got node 1 and node 2, which are nodes within the cluster SQL cluster. We need to basically enable advanced features, so make sure advanced features is enabled. Right click on the SQL OU, choose properties, go to security, click on advanced, and then under add we need to select a security principal, change it to computers, and then we type in the name of the cluster, which is SQL cluster. Click check name, click OK, and then the granular permission we're actually looking for is create computer objects. So you can see there, create computer objects. Click on OK, click on apply, and then click on OK, and then OK again. So we've now gave the cluster permissions to be able to create computer objects on the SQL OU, so that will allow the cluster to create the computer account for the listener. We now need to basically go into DNS, and as part of the listener configuration, it also creates an A record for the listener. So on our forward lookup zone, we need to basically click on properties, and then under security, we've got to basically add our cluster account. So I'll click on add, object types, computers, and then from here we'll type in Citrix cluster. And then what we need to do is we need to give it the create all child objects permissions. So we'll click on apply on that. So create all child objects, allow, and it's our cluster account again. Click apply, click on OK. Both of those things are required because, as I say, it has to create that DNS A record for the listener, and it also has to create the computer account in AD on the OU. So both of those are prereqs. So what we now need to do is we need to create some empty databases for Citrix. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump onto node 1, and I'm going to fire up SQL Server Management Studio by launching it. I'm just going to connect to node 1. Node 1 will be our primary replica. This will be our primary instance. So I'm just going to click to node 1, and then from here I'm going to create 4 new databases. I'm going to create a database for the site, the monitoring database, and also the login database. Those databases will be used for our Citrix Virtual Apps and Desktops 1912 installation, which we'll set up in a future video. We'll also create a database for Citrix PVS, because we'll also be installing and configuring Citrix PVS in a later video as well. So with databases selected, we're just going to create these empty databases. I'm going to call them Citrix site and then AO to specify always on. There is some options that we need to select to make sure this works correctly. We've got to set the recovery model to full, and then we've got to enable read committed snapshots as well. This is all Citrix recommended best practice. So is read committed snapshot on? We'll set that to true. We've also got to make sure the correlation is set correctly. As we chose the collation during the installation of SQL, it will use the default collation. But if we want to set that, we can choose the correct collation. It is Latin 1 General 100 CIASKS, which is this one here. Latin 1 General 100 CIASKS. So we'll select that. We'll click on OK, and that database is now created. We need to repeat this process for the rest of the databases, so I'll quickly go through this. Citrix Mon, so this will be our monitoring database. Again, full recovery model. We'll make sure read committed snapshots is enabled. Set that to true, and then under the collation, we'll make sure that it's using the correct collation. Latin 1 general 100 CI ASKS, which is that one there, CI ASKS. Click on OK, and then we'll create another database for our login. Collation Latin 1 general 100 CI ASKS, that one there. We'll make sure the recovery model set to full. Read committed snapshots, set that to true. Click on OK. And now we'll create our final database, which will be for PVS. Citrix PVS, always on. Again, we'll choose the collation. Latin 1 general 100 CI ASKS. Again, full recovery model. Read committed snapshots. PVS database. I don't normally set read committed snapshots. It's normally only for the Citrix databases that needs to be set, so we'll just leave that for now. Okay, so one of the prereqs before we start setting up always on high availability and our availability groups is we need to have a backup of basically the databases. So I'm just going to quickly take a backup of each database. If we don't do this when we run the availability group wizard, it will complain that there isn't a backup and the prereqs won't have been met. So we'll take a full backup of each database. I'm just going to quickly go through this. All task backup, full backup, database, click on OK. Same for the login database, tasks, backup, full backup, database, OK. Do the same for PVS, backup, full backup, OK on that. So we've now backed up. We've created 4 empty databases. We've set the correct collation. We've enabled read committed snapshots, and we've also set the recovery model to full. And we've also took a backup as well. So the next thing we need to do is we need to create a share again. So as part of the initial seed, when we're creating the availability group, it will do an initial sync where it copies the backup of the databases to the replica instance. So to do that, I typically create a file share. So on my domain controller, I'm going to create a new share. If we go onto the C drive, and then we'll just create a new folder, and then we'll call it SQL Always On Sync. Okay, so SQL Always On Sync. What we're going to do is we're going to share that folder, and then from the permissions we're going to remove everyone, and then we're going to add both our cluster nodes and our cluster. So node 1, give that full control. Node 2, full control. And then SQL cluster, our cluster name, we'll give that again full control. So that's basically that file share complete. Again, this is just for the initial sync and the backup. It will copy the databases and do the initial sync and set everything up on the replica instance once we're setting up the availability group. So I'll show you that now. So if we go back to node 1, if we now click on always on availability groups, if we click on the wizard, new availability group wizard, it's now giving us the option to create a new availability group. So what we're going to be doing is clicking next. We'll give this a name. So the availability group name, I'm just going to call it Citrix Always On AG 1912, which matches the version of Zen Desktop that we'll be installing. So this is the availability group name. We'll be using Windows Server Failover Cluster because we've got that configured. We're going to click Next, and then we're now going to choose our databases that we want to add to this availability group. Because we backed up the databases earlier, we now meet all the prereqs. If we didn't do that, it would have moaned that the databases haven't been backed up, so they wouldn't have met the prereqs. So I'm going to add all 4 databases to the availability group. Click on Next. We now get to choose basically our primary replica, so our first SQL instance, and also our second SQL instance, which will be the secondary replica. So what we need to do here, we need to click on Add Replica. We click on Node 2, click on Connect, and we're going to enable automatic failover, so it changes to synchronous commit, and we're going to have a readable secondary as well. We'll enable readable secondary as well. Under endpoints, it shows the endpoint URL for node 1 and node 2. Backup preferences, you can get to choose where the backups occur. Typically you want your backups occurring on the secondaries, because then it won't impact the primary replica where your production databases are live. So it's always recommended to set that to secondary only. We're not going to be doing that at the moment. We'll download some scripts later and get the maintenance plan set up so we can get some backups of the databases, but at the moment that's not needed. So we're going to create a new listener. So if we click on create an availability group listener, we need to give it a name. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to type in the listener name. So I'm going to type in Citrix Always On AG 1912. The port is going to be 1433, which is the default SQL port. I'm going to give it a static IP, and then I'm going to give it an IP address. We're going to be using 192.168.3.133. Actually go to 134, and it's going to be in the 192.168.3 network. Click on OK, and then we're going to click on Next, and then this is where we do the initial seeding. So it will start the data synchronization. It creates full database backups, and then it will restore the databases on the secondaries and add them to the availability groups. So we're going to click on this full database and log backup, and then we'll click on browse, and then we've created that share on DC01. So I'm just going to type on that, click on browse, expand DC01, and then we've got our SQL always on sync. Okay, I'm going to select that. You do not have permissions. Contact your network administrator to request access. Okay, I'm just going to go back to DC01 and just check the permissions on that share. SQL Always On sync. Advanced sharing permissions. So we've got node 1, node 2, SQL cluster. I think it's because we've not got the everyone group. I'm just going to check that. This is on the previous one that I did previously. Yeah, okay. So rather than adding the cluster nodes, we'll just it doesn't use the permissions. It doesn't need the cluster nodes and the cluster account. It's just it's whoever's running the always on availability group wizard needs permissions. So what I'll do is we'll edit the permissions on that. and then we'll just add the everyone group, and then we'll give that full control. Click apply, click OK, click on close, close out of that, go back to node 1. We'll choose the SQL Always on sync share, click OK, and now it's OK. So we'll click on next. It will now do some validations. Everything's come back with green tick and success, which is good. Click on next, and then we'll click on finish. And now it's setting up our always on availability group, and it's adding the databases to the availability group. It's setting it up on the primary replica and also on the secondary replica, and it's also configuring our always on availability group listener. So you can see everything's come back as good, all success, which is good. Click on close, and now if we have a look on node 1, if we expand our availability group under availability replicas, we can see node 1 is primary, node 2 is secondary. If we expand availability databases, we've got the Citrix log always on, Citrix monitoring always on, Citrix PVS always on, and the Citrix site always on databases added to the availability group. Under availability group listeners, we've got our new listener. If we go to Active Directory and we check the OU, what we should see is we should see a new computer account for the listener, which is there. So you can see the computer accounts being created. If we check in DNS, expand the forward lookup zone, look in the carmo.com DNS zone, we should see an A record for our listener. Yep, there it is there. You can see host records that points to the IP address that we configured for our listener, 192.168.3.134. So you can see the computer object for the listeners being created successfully, the A records being created successfully. If we now open the Failover Cluster Manager on node 1, what we should see under roles, we should see our listener, and then we should see the resources. So we've got the name and also the IP address, and they're added as cluster resources. They're all online, which is good. So everything appears to be working correctly. What we can do as well is we can have a look at the always on high availability dashboard. Click on the availability group name, and what we need to confirm is we need to confirm that the databases are shown as synchronized, and both the primary replica and the secondary replica are online, and everything is shown as synchronized. So everything is working. Everything's been configured. We've successfully set up a failover cluster. We've set up always on availability groups. We've created our databases. We've added them to an availability group. We've created our availability group listener. We've added the databases to our replicas, and everything is working how it should. I'm going to stop the video now, and then in the next video we'll kick off the installation of our Citrix Virtual Apps and Desktops 1912 site, and we'll get these databases populated with the tables and the schema once we create the site. Thank you.